New Mexico territory, late summer, a sky like hammered tin. Heat shivers the mesa until distance looks like water that isn't there. A broken wagon kneels in a bone-white arroyo. One wheel spins without touching earth. Vultures ride the thermals. A dust devil rakes the wash, flinging grit that stings eyes and gums. Far off, thunder crawls over the red buttes and brings no rain. Mercy Kincaid, a young settler widow cast out by her husband's kin to fetch help, is left with a cracked axle, one canteen, and a tin box holding the deed to a spring every ranch wants. Hired riders hunt her. The only soul within hail is a limping Civil War veteran the town calls useless, Caleb North, who swears he won't kill again. At dusk, a lone rider crests the ridge, hat brim burning with last light, his reins braided with human hair. He lifts a hand in greeting and shows Mercy a wedding ring she recognizes. But the rider who appeared at dusk was no savior. This account survives in a sheriff's deposition where one name was scratched out, and in a Fort Stanton hospital file, sealed under 2 different patient names. Next, you'll see why that single erasure and that double entry changed the fate of every soul in this county. The last daylight thinned to copper, and then to ash, while Mercy stood with her palm pressed to the hot plank where she'd hidden the tin box. The dust devil spent itself in a sigh and folded into the wash. The rider came slow, the human hair reins whispering against his horse's neck like something alive. Mercy's breath hurt. She had not seen her husband's wedding ring in 3 days. Now it gleamed between the outlaw's fingers, a coin to buy her fear. "You'll give me the deed," he said, friendly as a fence snake, "and I'll give you the shade of a roof tonight." His smile didn't reach his eyes. The braid on his reins swung when he turned his wrist, and Mercy saw charms knotted in, a brass button, a copper penny, a dried knuckle bone no bigger than a child's marble. The vultures drifted lower. Mercy didn't look up. She set her jaw and made herself count. 1 main rider, 2 shadows behind him on the ridge, still as brush, a 4th farther off, smoking or pretending to. Her canteen knocked her hip when she shifted. 3 mouthfuls left, maybe 2 if she gave one to the horse. She had hidden the tin box under a false plank when the dust came. If she showed fear now, the men would smell it like a wolf smells blood. A tap sounded in the wash, deliberate and steady, cane ferrule on stone. The man who used it came out of the shimmer with his hat brim low and his mouth set small, as if each step cost him. He wore a coat too large for his shoulders and boots cut higher on the left to balance the bad leg. He took the dust like an old tree takes wind. He did not hurry. He did not look like he could. Mercy had seen him once in town, holding the rail outside the general store, while boys imitated his, limp and laughed. He had looked at a far wall then, quiet as a nail. Now he said, "She's under my protection," in a voice the air didn't argue with. Hollis laughed. Mercy didn't know his name yet, only the color he carried, that iron warmth of a man who thinks the world belongs to his hands. "Make the cripple kneel," he said, without looking away from Mercy. It was a small order, said lazily. The 2 men on the ridge shifted their horses and started down. Caleb North did not kneel. He planted the cane and eased the other hand behind him, as if scratching his back. Mercy saw the small movements and thought of how a hawk moves its shoulders before it falls. The cane's head had a crosshatch worn by a long grip. The ferrule fitted snug in the wash gravel. His bad leg shook once and was still. "Ma'am," he said to Mercy, "when I tell you, go for the rocks. Stay low." It was quiet counsel, the kind you'd pass a child in a thunderstorm. The first rider took his hat off in mock politeness and reached down to grab the cane. Caleb turned his wrist, and the cane's head yawned like a jaw. From the shaft slid a stunted length of oiled steel, with a hinge and a ghost of rifling. He didn't shoulder it. He braced it to his hip and let the steel kiss the dry dark. The shot cracked the dusk in 2. The hat flew one way. The rider went the other, a surprised sound leaving him, as if the ground had made a joke he didn't get. Mercy moved. Grit tore her skirt. The wash's white ribs bit her shins. The second man kicked to flank the cripple, and the limping veteran turned on the bad leg in a slow pivot. Another boom sounding like thunder, deciding at last to come down. The horse screamed and sat. The man rolled under it, pinned. Hollis didn't laugh now. He put the ring away and drew his pistol with a smooth, thoughtless grace. The third shadow on the ridge lifted a rifle and then lowered it when Hollis didn't signal. They liked games. "Enough," Hollis said. "You keep a trick in that stick, old dog. One more, and I put a hole in the woman. Deed for mercy. That's fair trade." Mercy had reached the rocks. The white sandstone held a little cool under its lip. She tasted iron in her mouth and didn't know if it was blood or fear. When she thought of the ring, her belly went hollow with the answer she had not wanted to carry since the morning her husband rode off. She kept still and pressed her body flat and slid her hand under the plank to feel the tin's edge like a heartbeat under a floorboard. She should run now, but there was nowhere to run. The desert ran faster. Caleb's face had the color of old paper. Sweat made clean tracks through dust on his temples. He rested the short rifle back into the cane and closed the seam. "I'll go with you," he said to Hollis, "and she'll follow at a distance. Your word no man touches her hair. You got a mother somewhere. Put one on your head." "Had," Hollis said. Something flickered in his eyes and went out. "Word's good enough until it ain't. Bring the stick." Caleb didn't look back at Mercy. 2 hours, he said, as if to the air. 1 star up, then 2. He spoke like a man counting his own steps to a grave and wanting the grave to hear him coming. Mercy wanted to shout no and couldn't. Caleb gave her nothing at all to hold except a look so brief she might have dreamed it. The smallest nod, a wordless charge placed in her hands. Live. They went east in a line. 3 riders, 1 limping man walking, 1 horse dragging its dead leg, and Mercy a ghost behind them in the rocks. The sky deepening to bruise. The wash turned and found no ocean. Far off, a coyote sounded like a woman laughing until the laugh changed to a question. Mercy drank a mouthful from the canteen and closed her throat against the rest. When she lifted her head again, the riders were at the notch called Devil's Ladder, and the wind changed in a way that made her skin try to move. She smelled old ashes. She knew in her bones she wasn't the first to be asked for a deed at that place. In town, before the sun dropped, laughter had stuck to the boardwalks. Boys had whittled slivers from an apple crate and flicked them at a tin sign, while a man with a cane leaned on the rail and watched what they were pretending to be. The saloon girls leaned in the windows, like flowers that know who cuts them. Sheriff Tom Dorn nodded to shopkeepers and said words that kept a shape of peace like paper holds the idea of a tree. When Hollis crossed the street, a man in a black apron looked down at his ledger and made a small mark in the margin. Jonah Pike always made small marks. They were cheaper than words. Eliza Dorn wiped dust from the schoolhouse slates and traced letters again so children would remember them after a storm. When her brother came to the door, he looked weary. She put a hand to his sleeve. "You look like you've been keeping another man's hours," she said. "I keep the county's," he said, flat with practice. "Stay in tonight. Some riders in. Eliza," he added when she turned, "don't fix your heart on law. Fix it on right." It was a strange thing for a sheriff to say. It sounded like someone else in him speaking through his mouth. At Devil's Ladder, Hollis set a small fire and warmed his hands, as if he owned the cold, too. Little Fox crouched on his heels and read the wind. He didn't look at Mercy when she crept nearer. He was counting in the dust with a stick. 1, 2, 3. Then he wiped them away with his palm. He spoke softly in English that had been taught by a trader with a lazy mouth. "North wind sits low, like a dog that got whipped," he said. "Owl called at noon. That means a name is going to ground. Maybe mine, maybe yours." Mercy listened. The words were not comfort, but they were true and clean. She had not had that all week. Hollis watched the cripple eat nothing and drink nothing. "You got a name for your stick?" he said. "It ain't a pet," Caleb said. Hollis smiled. "Men give names to the things that make them feel big. I named my gun Sunday. All my good work happens then." Little Fox looked at Mercy's hands and the dirt in her nails where the plank had scraped her wrist. he said, almost to the ground. You hid the little house for papers under the wagon. That is wise. The man who left you will come back when he feels safe. Eyes like his always do. Mercy felt something in her chest tear along a line that had already been marked. He won't, she said. She wanted the words to be stone. They were only air. In the night, the wind laid down. The fire spoke to itself in small tongues. Caleb's head nodded once, and then he was awake, fast as a fox from sleep to stillness. Little Fox lifted his chin. Someone was coming without light. Careful. Hollis didn't turn his head. His hand slid to the pistol and rested there like a man resting on his own heart. The horse that had been shot put its head on the ground and sighed like a man tired of rooms. Sheriff Dorn came into the fire circle with his hat in his hand. He looked older. He looked like a man who wanted a chair and couldn't afford one. Evening, he said. I'm here to keep the peace. He didn't say whose peace. His eyes did not land on Mercy, long enough to be counted. You'll escort the lady, Hollis said. Make sure she gives me a square deal. That's the idea, the sheriff said, calm as milk. He nodded to Caleb. Evening, North. Caleb said nothing. Mercy watched the lawman's eyes travel to the tin box like a moth knows where a candle is. Dorn signaled a deputy over his shoulder. The man in the dark moved to the mule that carried Mercy's bundle and tugged at the pack lashings with fingers that didn't know patient work. The bundle slipped. Canvas split like old cloth. Things fell. A folded dress she had not worn since the wedding supper. A small frame with a lock of hair. A label stiff as bone that tumbled once and lay white side up in the firelight. Caleb saw it first, and then the sheriff did, and then Hollis, who didn't care what it said so long as it could be used. The card read in army print, Fort Stanton Hospital, patient, Caleb North, alias, Clay Norton. No one spoke for a breath long enough to hear the fire lick a coal. Little Fox looked from the word alias to Caleb's face, and then to the sheriff's, and he nodded to himself like a man who's found a track under leaves. Hollis smiled without his teeth and put his gun away as if that piece of paper had done his work for him. Mercy felt the world reconsider itself around the name that wasn't a name. They wrote me twice, Caleb said, and the quiet had a crack in it now. The kind men find when they put a knife into wood to split it. I was 2 men for a little while, that's all. 2 files, Hollis said. 2 lives. A man like that owes 2 debts. He plucked the card and tucked it into his vest, without looking at it again. Tomorrow, he said, and the word felt wrong in the night air, too smooth, like a gambler's coin rolling. We trade at noon at the church so the Lord can witness. Deed for boy. He jerked his thumb at Little Fox and laughed when the tracker's mouth thinned. And bring your stick. I want to see if the old dog can do tricks under a bell. They didn't sleep much. Mercy tried and saw her husband's hand on a ledger she had not known existed, and woke with grit in her teeth where she had clenched. Caleb sat with his back to the rock and his eyes on the fire's last red. Once he made a motion to reach into his coat and stopped, his hand hovering over a breast pocket, like a man not sure if a letter inside would forgive him or condemn him if he read it. Little Fox taught the dark to speak. Coyote says, take only what you can carry. Owl says, dig deep. Ant says, hide. Which do you listen to? Whatever keeps a woman alive, Caleb said, and his voice had sand in it. When light came, it came mean, with no softness at the edges. They went down out of the ladder with the county waking like a man with a hangover. The church stood plain in the square, with a bell that had rung for births and for drought prayers and for 3 funerals that shouldn't have been. Reverend Amos Bell met them on the steps with his hands folded behind his back, where a pistol set tight in the spine of a hymn book waited like a truth you don't want to speak aloud. House of God is not a market, the Reverend said. It's where covenants live, Hollis said. We're better to exchange one. Sheriff Dorn lifted one palm. We do this proper, he said. No gunplay. He said it to the crowd, not to the men who would decide. Jonah Pike stood at the edge of the square with his ledger under his arm like a child he didn't want to put down. He had the face of a man who sees his own end in every grin. He watched the bell rope sway in a wind that wasn't there and took his pencil out, though there was nothing to write yet. Eliza came to the schoolhouse door and took in the line. Mercy pale, but straight. Caleb like a scar that learned to walk. Hollis pleased with his shadow. Her brother wearing the look of a man who had been bargaining with a wolf and believed he had bought a friend. Hollis put 2 fingers to his mouth and whistled. His men came from side streets like roaches from under a dish. One led Little Fox with a rope looped high on his arms and tight enough to blue the skin. The tracker's head was held proud, but a cut marked his ear where a knife had explained the joke. Some of the town looked away, some didn't. That's how towns are. Mercy felt eyes slide over her and stop on the tin box, and then slide again, as if the box made a sound only greed can hear. She wanted to clutch it, and didn't. She held it like bread someone else should have. Caleb stood to her left, his cane set on the church step, as if pinning the whole building to the earth. He leaned just enough to take weight. His coat moved with the wind and showed the dull shine of metal where wood should be. The crowd took in the sight with a murmur that had hope laid over fear, like lace over a bruise. Reverend Bell read a short verse in a voice that did not shake. The sheriff nodded, as if that made a thing lawful. Hollis stepped forward and put his hand on the tin box, and Mercy put hers over his, and for a second neither yielded, and the rope on Little Fox went tighter, and his breath hissed, and Caleb's mouth flattened, and Jonah Pike, who had been waiting for a word from his ledger to tell him what to do, made a mark anyway, because that is what he does. Enough, Sheriff Dorn said again, but there was a dry place in the word. He looked at Hollis and gave a little nod. He thought no one noticed. Eliza did. Now, Hollis said, and his men shifted the rope as if to lead Little Fox forward, and a gun whispered somewhere behind Caleb, soft as a cylinder turning. Eliza screamed his name. He turned, too slow. The first shot took the hat brim off the sheriff's head and nailed it to the doorpost like a visiting card. The second shot came half a heartbeat after and struck the ground where Caleb's foot had been before he turned. The sound that followed was not thunder. It was the courthouse of the county giving permission for hell. Reverend Bell dropped the hymn book, and the pistol came free like a secret loosed. Jonah Pike flinched and clutched his ledger and thought of the 8 toe tags he had laid out at dawn without letting himself ask why. And Mercy moved. She didn't think. She moved with something hot in her chest and bit Hollis's wrist where his skin was thin. He cursed and snatched back, and the tin box loosened, and Caleb's cane broke open like a mouth again. He didn't shoulder it like a soldier on parade. He rocked like a tree in gust, and the cut-down rifle barked in a voice the square had heard once, years ago, across a different set of bodies. The rope to Little Fox sang when the bullet kissed it apart. The tracker fell forward and rolled behind the pump, like a boy who has done this since he could walk. Hollis's man who had fired the first backshot took the second that Caleb owned. He folded like bad paper. The sheriff's eyes went wide and then small as calculation took the place of surprise. He drew. He aimed at the cripple. He hesitated that sliver when a man decides which life he is buying. The bell began to swing, slow at first, and then with purpose. Though no rope pulled it, the town found cover. Dust leapt. 2 more of Hollis's men fired into the church steps, and splinters came up like thrown wheat. Mercy heard a child cry and saw Eliza pull a boy into the schoolhouse and slam the door with her own body. Reverend Bell put a bullet through a gunhand's shoulder with a prayer under it and didn't apologize. Mercy went down hard and held the tin like an infant and thought, in the clear place, you sometimes get inside blood and noise. If I live, I will live different. Caleb walked. He didn't run. He couldn't. He put his bad leg where his body would forgive it and turned his whole life around it. And each time the cut-down rifle spoke, a man learned something he had early chosen not to. Hollis moved behind a water trough, and then behind a pile of lumber, and then behind a woman whose husband had done business with him. And Mercy saw the calculation in his eyes, the way he measured people, as if they were barrels of flour and bullets and heat, and could be traded when the price looked right. She didn't think. She lunged, and her teeth found his wrist again, and he slammed her head into the trough and stars went off in her skull, and she held the box even then. The sheriff took a breath and raised his pistol and would have fired If Eliza's voice had not broken across the square, with his name in it, the way it had sounded when they were children, and a dog had gone rabbit in the yard. He looked at her. It was the smallest turn of the head. Caleb's third shot took the hat off him clean, and burned a line through his hair. The fourth found the brim of Hollis's trophy braid and split it, and hair came down like dead grass, and Hollis raged with a sound that was mostly pride bleeding. The fifth didn't come then. The fifth waited. Mercy didn't know why. She would later. Little Fox slid to Mercy's side like a shadow that had been told to go somewhere and went, and he took the tin from her hands and tucked it into his shirt, where no man would put a bullet without hating himself after. "Run when I say," he told her, and his lip bled, and his ear bled, and his eyes were steady as winter. The square settled into that sharp kind of quiet where each sound has a name, a boot scraping stone, the bell's breath, a pistol hammer cocking, the undertaker's pencil. Somewhere a baby hiccuped into stillness, told without words by a hand over a mouth to learn silence early. Caleb tasted metal, and it was not from the gun. He had stood like this before, with men calling him one name in daylight and writing another in ledgers at night, and the weight of those names hung at his throat like two small stones tied with one string. Hollis chanced the trough and made for the alley, and Sheriff Dorn shifted to block Caleb's sight line, and then caught Eliza's eyes again, and looked ashamed without moving his face. And Mercy saw it, and understood something about men with badges, how they can dig their own graves with words they think are fences. "Drop it," the sheriff said to Caleb, and the way he said it told the truth. His badge wouldn't. "You won't shoot me." Caleb looked at him, and the years between where they stood and a field back east, where men lay until morning, made a river between them. "You're right," he said. "I'll shoot past you." He did. Hollis jerked as if someone had yanked a wire in his back, and his pistol jumped. The bullet he had meant for Mercy put a chip in the church step where a child had chalked a letter 2 days before. Mercy crawled toward that small white and thought of her own name the first time she had written it after she had married, and how a letter can be a kind of deed, and how men think they own letters because ink dries in straight lines. The square emptied of courage. Those who had a little used it. Those who didn't found excuses to stand aside. Reverend Bell put his hand on the parish register and felt the leather give a little under his palm as if it had breath, and he thought of all the names written there and all the names that had been refused, and wondered whether God kept a second book for men like Sheriff Dorn and himself on days like this. He took the register and slid it under the altar and stood up again with the hymn book pistol and said, "No more death," and went to make that lie true by doing what he hated. Hollis bled and smiled through it. The look in his eyes now wasn't humor. It was math. He had started with more men than the other side. He had more still. He raised his pistol and aimed at the place where Caleb's coat moved with breath, and then aimed lower because he had learned something about the bad leg, watching the man turn. He fired. Caleb flinched and made no sound. He made none because the sound had been pressed out of him years ago when a different bullet found a different place. He put his hand to his side, and it came away hot. He didn't look at it. He set the cane's ferrule on stone and leaned and looked at Mercy for the second time in 2 days. And what he said was not for her. It was to the thing in her that had refused to bend when the wind came. "This is yours now," he said. "Make it keep the peace." He meant the cane and the gun within it, and the old right to decide when a wrong stops moving. Mercy shook her head without meaning to. No to the request. No to the bullet in his side. No to the ledger of men that said what should follow. Little Fox touched her shoulder in a way that settled the air. "He tells the truth," the tracker said. "Sometimes the thing that kills is the only thing that keeps you." Hollis pushed off the trough and lifted his pistol a last time, as if he had found a coin under his tongue. His hand shook, and he grinned, as if that pleased him. The fifth shot came then from Caleb's gun, and it did not go where a proud man's heart sits. It went through the laugh instead, and left the mouth trying to hold a shape with nothing left to fill it. The crowd breathed as one animal does when a trap opens. Men who had been holding still moved. Women who had been holding breath let it go. The bell stopped. Reverend Bell lowered the pistol. Sheriff Dorn looked at his sister the way men look at a door they cannot open when fire is behind them. Jonah Pike opened his ledger and wrote 9. He did it before the bodies were counted. He did it because some things a man knows ahead of time and hates himself for knowing. Caleb swayed. The rifle slid back into the cane with a small homecoming sound. He made one step and then another, and the bad leg buckled, and Mercy put her shoulder under his good arm and took more weight than she had, and Little Fox took the other side, and together they made a small shelter that moved. There was no quiet in the town that followed. There was only the thrum of what would have to be done. The sheriff put his pistol in his belt and sat down on the church step because he didn't trust his legs. Eliza came and stood in front of him and didn't speak. He looked up and tried to find the words he had bought from himself and couldn't count them. "I'll fetch a doctor," someone said. "No," Jonah Pike said, and his voice surprised even him. "Fetch my table." He did not mean it cruelly. He meant it straight. He had laid out toe tags at dawn. He would not be ashamed of doing the work his hand knew. He closed his ledger then, and his finger found a place on the grain where someone had cut their name once with a pocket knife. He couldn't read it. He didn't need to. Mercy saw blood on her hands that wasn't hers, and wasn't sure where the line ran between sin and duty anymore. She looked at the tin box where it sat against Little Fox's ribs. She looked at the sheriff, who would have taken it clean if a paper card had not shaken loose. She looked at Caleb, who had been 2 men on the government's page and 1 man in the dust. The air in the square had changed. The town could feel the change coming, like cattle smell rain before a cloud shows. Mercy did not know yet what the change would cost. Reverend Bell went inside and set the pistol under the pulpit. He put his hands on the parish register and then opened it and wrote in a cramped hand, "Witnessed, deed to Spring to be held in trust for town until rightful claims answered before God and men." He blotted the line and closed the book and slid the bolt on the altar cabinet. He did not pray. He knew what men were about to do. He knew God heard fine, without an extra word, from a man who had just fired a pistol in front of an altar. On the far edge of the square, a rider watched from under a brim dusted gray with road. He had a paper in his breast pocket with a line erased and an H showing like a bone through thin skin. He turned his horse when no one was looking because he had learned to move when others counted. His smile was thin as a knife you hide in a boot. Caleb stood by, holding on to the edge of a barrel and forcing breath in and out in even measures. Mercy put her hand on his sleeve. He looked at it, then at her. "That file," she said. "At the fort. Why 2 names?" "So a man could quit a job and the county could say it kept him," he said. "1 to bury, 1 to send. Work to." He looked past her to Sheriff Dorn. "Ask your lawman whose handwriting sits under the scratch on the deposition. Looks to me like a careful man's." Eliza heard and turned. "What scratch?" she said too sharply. Dorn flinched the way men flinch when a dog they love growls. In the afternoon, after the bodies were taken, and the women had scrubbed the step, and Jonah had made his entries, wax covers 9, 1 to be decided, and children had been sent to fetch water with serious faces, Mercy and Little Fox and Caleb sat under the schoolhouse eave in a slice of shade the length of an arm. The wind came back, kinder now, like a mother who has finished speaking hard and wants to smooth a brow. Little Fox took a rawhide cord from his pouch and tied a small feather to the cane just below the seam, a sign no white man would know, but which a boy born to the plains would read from a mile. "This belongs to a person who stands." "Next," Little Fox said softly, so only their small shade could hear. "Hollis will not come alone. The man he serves will come." "Name him," Mercy said. Little Fox touched his ear, where the cut had dried. "He doesn't like names. He scratches them. He pays men to keep wind over their mouths. His house looks like a courthouse, but his hands look like a butcher's." Eliza brought a basin and set it down and said nothing, because sometimes women know talk is a second wound. She washed Mercy's hands and did not flinch when the water went pink. She nodded to Caleb the way a sister nods to a man who has done the most and will pay the most. Sheriff Dorn watched from the door of his office and knew the scratch on the paper in his desk would be a larger thing tomorrow than the badge on his vest was today. Toward evening, a boy ran from the direction of the undertaker's room, with his eyes big and his words tumbling. Jonah Pike's door was open, he said. The ledger wasn't on the shelf. The ledger wasn't anywhere. Jonah had never let it out of his reach. It had names in it that belonged to men who had said they were not the kind to be written. People turned and looked at each other, as if the missing book itself stared. "Find it," Sheriff Dorn said, too quick. Eliza looked at him and then at Mercy, and at the blood shadow dried on the church step, and something in her set like sugar when it hardens. She would find the key to her brother's desk tonight. She would open what had not been opened since spring. She would read the deposition with the scratch and see what letter showed through like a bone. She would learn whether the law she believed in was a coat her brother wore over something else. The sun slanted and lost heat. The bell rope hung still and innocent. The square looked almost like any frontier square at eventide, with dust and gossip and a child practicing a chalk letter where a chip marred the step. Only the way people spoke told the truth, short, flat, and fast, like men in a barn. Fire. Mercy lay on the cot Eliza kept for sick children and watched the ceiling boards as if words were written there, and she could read them lying down. She did not sleep. Her body was empty of salt and full of fear, and the fear had changed shape. It wasn't the fear of dying in the wash with her tongue thick and her hands blistered. It was the fear of living wrong after you've been shown right. She thought of the spring. She thought of putting it in trust for the town, because a book said so, and because a good man with a hymn book pistol had written a line. She thought of men who scratch their names out of papers and still take water. She thought of the old deeds to land that had belonged to people before her, to Little Fox's people, who read the wind where she read ink. Caleb sat on the steps under the schoolhouse and kept the cane across his knees. Once he slid the hinge open with a thumb and closed it again, listening to the small click that had been the last sound some men had heard. He put his hand on the feather Little Fox had tied and found a kind of quiet there that surprised him. He watched the square and saw a man glance too often at the sheriff's office window and make as if to go by, and then go by again, and he put his hand on the cane and did not rise. He was not hunting, he was waiting. There is a difference. In the red close of day, Eliza slipped her brother's old desk key from a teacup where he had thought no one would look because he never looked at the things he loved when he hid from himself. She fit it to the lock and turned slow. The drawer stuck. She breathed out and pulled. The paper inside smelled like damp and dust and men who keep secrets under their tongues. She lifted the sheriff's deposition and held it to the window so the last light ran through the scratch like water through a cut in ice. She saw the downstroke that refused to die. The letter showed itself. H, not for Hollis, for a different hand. She turned a page and another, and the names spoke in a chorus of ink. When she closed the drawer again, her face looked like a woman who has set her own bone, without a doctor. In the dark, a boot heel scuffed the lane behind the undertaker's. Jonah Pike looked up from where he sat, with his head in his hands. A shape knelt beside him and set the ledger on the step. It had not been far. It had been held in a safe place, while a copy was made of one page under a piece of glass, with the light behind. The shape's voice was gentle and dry, like wind through sage. "You can't hide a bell," it said, "but you can tune it so folks hear what song you want." Jonah took the ledger like a man takes communion when he doesn't think he deserves it. "Why help me?" he asked. "Because a woman bit a wolf," the shape said, amused, and stood and left. And Jonah felt a laugh rise in him that he would not forgive himself for later, and he let it come, because laughter is the only coin poor men have when the rich start counting bodies. When Mercy woke from the first minute of sleep she had managed in 2 days, the town was darker than it should have been. The moon had hidden. The air held a waiting that made dogs not bark. Little Fox stepped from the doorway without sound and put a finger to his lips. "Riders," he said, "not Hollis's. Men who smell like office ink. Men who think the ground belongs to their boots. Mercy sat up with the cane across her knees and felt the feather brush her wrist like a thing alive. She did not know yet that before morning she would point the muzzle at a man whose name sat under the scratch. Night came thin and strange, the way a town holds its breath when it feels a hand reaching for its throat. Dogs did not bark. The wind lay down and listened. Little Fox moved like water through the schoolhouse shadows and touched Mercy's wrist, and the feather on Caleb's cane brushed her skin like a living whisper. Riders came slow along the main street without calling out, as if they owned sound and could spend it later. Their horses had brass clips on the bridles, and their saddles had straps that had never seen dust. Men who smell like office ink, Little Fox had said, and Mercy understood that now, because the air carried starch and oil and the hard, flat smell of paper seals. They stopped at the sheriff's door and did not dismount, and a man with a square head and a perfect hat brim said the sheriff's full name in a voice that would read well from a courtroom rail. Thomas Andrew Dorn. The name sounded like a nail going in. The sheriff stepped out with his vest buttoned wrong at the top and a face that had not slept since the bell. He tipped his hat because habit is a kind of law. You obey, even when the law in your pocket is breaking. Harlan Beckett, he said, and the H hung in the air and found a home with the scratch on the deposition in Eliza's desk. Mercy felt the letter like a shape against her ribs. Harlan Beckett's ranch lay west and above the dry lands, and his men leased water by the bucket when the river ran thin. He did not ride into town at night unless he came to count. Mr. Sheriff, Beckett said friendly, you got a situation with a deed. You got a situation with a veteran traveling under 2 names. And now you got a dead man in your street who did favors for me from time to time. I am here to clean up. You mean own it, Eliza said from the edge of the schoolhouse porch before she could swallow the words. Beckett turned and let his eyes count her in a slow way that made her feel like a book he would read 2 pages of and then put down without saying why. Ma'am, he said, no need for heat. I bring writs from the territorial adjutant. I bring a notary. I bring a sealed affidavit naming one Clay Norton as deserter and bounty man for hire. I bring witnesses who can move the assets in question into responsible hands so we don't have more bodies than the undertaker can afford candles for. Jonah Pike put a hand over his ledger, where he sat on his stoop and snorted through his nose at the word candles. The men with Beckett noticed him, the way men notice a moth. They filed it away as something to swat later. Reverend Bell stood at his church door with his hand away from the pistol and the parish register locked under the altar. He felt the registers of men and God scrape across each other like 2 pieces of slate. Caleb stood without standing up all the way, the cane across his knees, the wound stitched with torn shirt and Eliza's neat, firm fingers. He hadn't asked what the stitches were made of. He had not asked a question he couldn't pay for in years. He listened to Beckett speak about writs and assets, and he watched the dogs of that man, not the horses, the men. One touched his holster too often for any hand but his own to like him. One smiled when there was nothing funny. One did nothing at all, and that was the one Caleb marked with the quiet part of his mind that knew how to live past midnight. Paper, Beckett said. He raised a hand, and his notary brought a folder with a ribbon, like a thin vein. Eliza's insides went cold. She had seen the top sheet across her brother's desk in light that turned scratches to script. She wanted to shout, but the shout would buy nothing now. She needed to aim different. Beckett opened the folder on the sheriff's saddle. Here, affidavit, Fort Stanton, 2 patient names for 1 man. That's fraud, or worse. A War Department letter that says the man called Clay Norton walked out of the field hospital the same night a colonel's private papers went missing. Then he puts on a county name like a coat and walks around under it. That's deception. That's survival, Mercy said before her mouth asked her permission. Beckett looked at her the way a banker looks at a coin that speaks. Mercy did not lower her eyes. Men come out of war with holes in them and stuff those holes with whatever they find. Names, liquor, work that scrapes a soul thin. You smell ink. All I smell is a man still breathing. Beckett's smile had no heat. "Breathing men sign deeds, Mrs. Kincaid," he said, "and give them to those who can keep a spring safe for the many. That tin box does not belong on a wagon wheel. It belongs in a vault, in your vault," Little Fox said softly. It did not sound like a question. Beckett's hat brim tilted a fraction. He had not been counting the boy yet. He did now. "Sheriff," Beckett said, letting the word work like a coin flipping from finger to finger. "Easy. Take the veteran into custody as Clay Norton under territorial authority. Take the deed into neutral keeping. We do this calm and clean." Sheriff Dorn swallowed. The square watched him try to find a shape for himself that would hold. Eliza's eyes were on him, steady and wide. The town had watched his hat nail itself to the door, and the skin strip from his pride. He could say no and be a man, or say yes and be a sheriff. He tried to be both, and ended up being neither. "Caleb," he said, and the first name came raw. "Give me the cane. Walk with me. It's for the night. Papers in the morning. I swear by the book on my desk." "Which book?" Eliza said, and the hush that fell then was not reverent. It was the hush a room gives when a woman puts truth flat on the table and men cannot find a cloth to cover it. Beckett did not look at Eliza. He looked at Caleb. "Old dog," he said, in the same soft drawl Hollis had used, and someone watching might have felt a small chill as the words went looking for a throat to wear. "Don't make me put you face down in dust in front of a lady." Caleb could have lifted the cane and made noise right there. He didn't. He looked at Mercy. He looked at Little Fox. He looked at the church where the register sat, and at the undertaker's door where a ledger waited with 9 written, and a space below that number like a mouth. He exhaled slow and lifted the cane by the middle and held it out to Dorn instead of to Beckett. It was a small thing, a threadbare choice in a ragged night, but it drew a line in the dust just the same. Dorn took the cane. His hand shook. The weight in it surprised him. He felt a kind of duty travel up his arm he had not felt from a badge in months. He moved to Caleb as if escorting a man to a pew, not to a cell. Beckett's eyes cooled a degree. "Neutral keeping," he said. "In my office," Dorn said back, and even Beckett had to nod because saying the word office made the shape of law rise like a scarecrow, and sometimes shapes fool even wolves for a minute. They put Caleb in the cell in back, while Eliza lit the lamp and set it where the light fell clean. The cane leaned against the desk. Mercy stood in the doorway with Little Fox, and the feather on the cane moved when no breath touched it. Eliza angled the lamp toward the drawer where the deposition lay. Beckett came in with 2 men, who looked around the office as if measuring the room for their own furniture. "I'll take the box for safekeeping," Beckett said, reaching a hand. Mercy moved the tin to her other hip as if it weighed nothing, and said, "Safe with me." Beckett's mouth went flat. He did not reach again. He nodded at one of his men, who nodded back in that fatherless way that means wait for dark. The night thickened. The town quartered itself into those who slept because they could, and those who lay awake with their eyes open. Reverend Bell read a line, and closed the book and put his head on his arm, and spoke none of the long prayers he knew. Jonah Pike sharpened his pencil for no reason, and dulled it with his thumb, and sharpened it again. Little Fox sat with his back to the jail wall, and listened to the ground for what it had to say about hooves that didn't want to be heard. Mercy kept her palm on the tin, and traced the seam with a nail until a nail broke, and bled, and she did not stop. Close to midnight, a blue light found the butte beyond town, and slipped along it like foxfire. Little Fox's head turned, and he made the small sound men make when something holy touches something old. Mercy saw it, and her chest eased in a way she could not explain. Eliza, inside the office, lifted the deposition and held it to the lamp again. She put the H to the wick and watched it glow gold around the cut. She had seen it by day. She wanted to see it by night. The letter did not change. Footsteps came, easy. The notary, a Mr. Sloan with narrow hands, brought a new paper for the sheriff to sign. It named Harlan Beckett, temporary trustee of any water asset, presently in disputed possession, due to female incapacity and veteran incompetence. He said the phrase like a line of scripture practiced, until no one remembers the sense. Eliza's mouth twitched when she heard it. Dorn looked like a man trying to swallow dry bread. Incapacity, Eliza repeated, and laughed without mirth. And Caleb in the cell laughed once with her, and Beckett raised 2 fingers, and his men moved a little, just a little, the way a snake moves its coil when the flute changes rhythm. Enough paper for one night, Dorn said, more to himself than to Beckett. He slid the paper back across his desk and put the lamp on it by mistake, so a bit of grease stained the legal margin. Sloane hissed, like something had burned him. "Tomorrow," he said, and Beckett nodded and patted the desk and said, "Tomorrow then," like a man promising a dog a better chain. When the writers left, they left fast, because men who carry paper travel in groups and hate corners. Little Fox watched their dust and listened to the way the earth liked or disliked the sound. "They will split before the river," he said. "Some to the fort, some to your spring." "My spring," Mercy said, trying the words like a boot you are not sure fits. "The town's spring now," Eliza said from the doorway, and her voice had a small iron in it that had not been there 2 days ago. "I wrote it in the register." Reverend Bell put his hand on it. "God saw." "Beckett's God reads ledgers," Jonah said, appearing out of the dark like a man called by his own name. "He thinks the rest are stories, but stories bite." He looked at Mercy, at the tin, at the cane. "Best sleep where paper can't find you," he said. Gravedigger's advice. They bedded in the schoolhouse again, Mercy and Eliza and Little Fox against the far wall, and the cane across the door, and a chair under the latch. Caleb lay on the cell cot with his bad leg propped, and his hand over the place where the bullet had gone in and come out clean. He would have slept if his body had not remembered the one night years ago when he lay on a different cot with a different name banded to his wrist in blue ink, and the colonel's men carding the ward for a ghost. He had been the ghost. He had walked out under a second name that fit like a stolen coat, and he had not taken it off, because under it his skin had been too thin to look at. He woke to a soft scrape, cat soft, chair leg soft. Eliza woke at the same moment. Mercy woke after, because a woman who has kept herself alive by listening in the dark can hear trouble put on soft shoes. Little Fox was already up, the feather on the cane, catching the lambent light from the lamp, left low on the sheriff's desk. The back door latch did not jingle. It lifted with care. A shadow came through like a man who lives in newspapers and has to move in the world sometimes anyway. He had a cloth bag with a drawstring and a confidence that makes men stupid. He stepped past the cane with his boot toe, brushing the feather, and did not notice. The feather twitched. The cane slid like a fish from where it had rested and thumped the floor with a small, honest noise no paper man would expect. Eliza was on him first with a slate in her hand. She brought it down on his wrist, and the bag fell, and coins scattered like tiny bells. He cursed and lunged for the desk drawer. Caleb spoke from the cell in the voice men keep under floorboards. "Don't," he said, and the word hit the man harder than Eliza's slate had. He froze. Mercy picked up the cane, and this time she did not hold it like a story. She held it like a tool. Little Fox took the man's collar and set him in the chair, and tied his hands with the drawstring he had brought to tie a ledger. Jonah Pike stepped into the door and said, in a tone even he had not heard in his own mouth in years, "If you were here for my book, you should have asked." Men don't ask, because they want to pretend the answers aren't theirs. The man in the chair, Mr. Sloane without his hat, looked at the 4 of them and found no one in the room he could talk down to. He swallowed and found a different tone. "I came for the deposition," he said. "Mr. Beckett wants the court copy. The scratch on the sheriff's copy makes it confusing." Eliza's eyes sparked. "The scratch shows the H," she said. Sloane shut his mouth like a man who has already stepped through one trap and sees another under his boot. "Names are hard," he said, trying a smile. "They go on paper and then they go crooked. My job is to straighten. My job is to lay straight the ones paper bends," Jonah said. Dorn came out in his shirt sleeves, with the sleep of a man caught between 2 debts, aching in his face. He took in Sloane in the chair, and the cane in Mercy's hands, and his own sister standing like a hinge between past and next. He nodded once to Caleb in the cell. "What are we keeping here?" he said. "A man or the idea of one?" No one answered. He looked at Sloane. "You go back to Beckett and tell him his writs wait for daylight like good men do. Touch my drawer again, and I'll have Reverend Bell write a new line in the register you won't like." It was a small throw of weight, the kind a tired sheriff can manage. Sloane took it and went, gathering his coins from Jonah's floor, with pride gone like a button. Eliza locked the door with the key from the teacup. She put the key around her neck on a ribbon, because some symbols become tools when you wear them right. Little Fox sat again, with his back to the wall, and smiled at Mercy's grip on the cane, not unkind. Morning came gray with a sky that meant wind, and then heat, and then more wind. Beckett did not ride in first this time. He sent a uniform with a letter from the adjutant at Fort Stanton that used words like jurisdiction and seizure and humanitarian custody. It offered to take the veteran for medical observation under either name. It offered to hold the deed as evidence pertinent to a water rights dispute. It did not offer to feed the town when the spring ran under a gate. Reverend Bell read the letter and said a word he had not said in his pulpit in 10 years. He folded the letter once and set it down in front of Dorn. "You want to live under that?" he asked quietly. "Or you want to live next to your sister and your people?" Dorn rubbed his eyelids. "I want not to drown," he said. He looked at Mercy. "You want to say? Say it now." Mercy didn't look at Beckett's messenger. She looked at Little Fox. "Where would your people stand?" she asked, "if a man tried to make a river his by writing it on a scrap?" Little Fox's eyes were brown, with flecks that caught light like mica. "We would laugh," he said. "Then we would take all the horses at night." Mercy smiled for the first time since her mouth had made a bite count. "I don't know how to steal horses," she said. "I know how to walk at noon with grit in my teeth and not cry. I say we carry paper to where paper cracks. The river bend, elders who remember which graves hold bones older than Mr. Beckett's house. Let them witness. Let them say to his face that water remembers names that never touched ink." Eliza's jaw set. "We will bring the register," she said. Reverend Bell started to say no, then said yes, because sometimes you have to take what is holy into the street to make it work. Jonah Pike closed his ledger and tucked it under his arm. "I will bring the line with 9, he said. "Men think body counts are ghosts. I think they are math. Mr. Beckett likes math." They went in a moving knot out of town. Not a parade, not a posse, not a mob, something else. Caleb walked with the cane, a little bent but with a rhythm that said, the leg remembered the drill even when the brain refused it. Beckett watched them go from under the hotel awning with a toothpick in his mouth and a look like a bookkeeper in front of a column gone wrong. He sent 3 riders by the back trail and pretended he had not. The messenger from the fort turned his horse as if bored, and as soon as the town's last roof was behind him, he galloped hard to bring words to men who don't wait for ink to dry. The river bend lay where cottonwoods made a green promise in a country of gray promises. The Comanche elders waited there without moving, which is a way of speaking the land listens to. Mercy and Eliza and Reverend Bell stepped down into the shade that had watched men argue and trade and kneel and run for longer than any of their books remembered. Little Fox went ahead with his hands open and spoke names. The elders listened without blinking, and then their eyes went to Mercy, and she held their gaze without showing her teeth. The oldest touched the tin box with one finger and looked at his own reflection in the dull lid and smiled like a man looking at a child who has found a toy and thinks it will last forever. Harlan Beckett came in slow on the far bank, so the sun shone behind him like a candle behind a saint. He took off his hat and put it back on without any need, because boys learn that trick from men who like to own pictures. He nodded to the elders as if their presence was a courtesy to him. He nodded to Reverend Bell as if God took meetings. He did not nod to Mercy. He did not nod to Caleb. He was not keeping that kind of book. The talk that followed was tight and sharp like wire. Mercy held up the tin box and said, "This deed says my husband's hand claims a spring that gives this town drink. He sold a wagon for cash the day he rode away. He took a ring off his finger he didn't deserve and it ended in a dead man's reins. He meant to trade me and the water together. He is gone. The deed shall not follow him." She opened the tin and showed the paper without letting anyone touch it. Reverend Bell opened the register and set a finger on the line he had written and let the elders see the script and the care in the hand. Jonah opened his ledger and showed the fresh 9, with wax, pooled neat on 9 places where his work had already gone. He did not show the blank he had left at the bottom. Beckett stood and listened, and then signaled his notary and said, "Mrs. Kincaid, the law favors structures over stories. You hold a paper. I hold papers. Mine bear seals from men who can send soldiers. Yours bears a line from a man who shot a pistol under a cross, and a name from another who just shot his own town quieter. Why don't we save us all trouble? Sign the trust over to me. I will build a sluice. I will pay you for your pain with coin and make you respectable again." Mercy looked down at the water and saw her face move in a way she didn't recognize. She had left a piece of herself in the wash the day the wagon broke. Fine, let it lie there and learn dust. The piece that stood now belonged to the spring and to men who had bled for it and to women who would lose children in heat if she bowed. "No," she said, "I will sign it where God sees and where old eyes see and where the wind can read. The town will hold it, not your vault, not your men. If you try to scratch my name, remember a bell rings, even when you cut the rope." The youngest elder's mouth twitched. Beckett's mouth did not. He said, "Sheriff, arrest Clay Norton." Dorn did not move. He watched a dragonfly right its course above the bend. When he spoke, his voice was the voice of a man who has slept in a bed he hated and is too tired to make a new bed. But he stands anyway. "I'll take him," he said, "after we witness the trust." Beckett's cheek ticked where a man's face shows when his pride hits the fence of another man's choice. He flicked his fingers, and 3 riders eased their horses into the shallows to make a line no paper had the right to draw. Then, Little Fox's head snapped up. He didn't look at the riders. He looked past Beckett to the cottonwoods on the far bank, where the shade bunched. A badge glinted, not a sheriff's. Fort, a captain with a square jaw and eyes that had been shut to sleep by marching, and nothing else. He raised one hand and tipped it, and the soldiers moved as if a single animal had 4 legs and 1 mind. They took the bank with light feet and rifles low. The captain called, "By authority of the United States, this man," and he paused to look at the paper. "Clay Norton is remanded to military custody pending inquiry." Caleb did not flinch. He stood without stiffening, which is harder. He looked at Mercy, and at Eliza, and at Dorn, and at Reverend Bell, and at the elders whose faces did not change when soldiers said the word "United." He set the cane across his palms like a man showing a loaf to the hungry. "If I go," he said, "it is under my name they made from me. They can have that. The other stays here." He nodded at Mercy, and at the tin, and at the register, and at Jonah's ledger. "Keep it." Mercy shook her head, heat in her eyes. "No, sometimes men go," Little Fox said, and it sounded like something the land had taught him. "If he stays now, blood spreads out like ants when you kick a mound. If he goes, it narrows to a line. Lines can be cut." Beckett smiled in a small private way. "There we are," he said. "The veteran walks. The deed waits. The county breathes easy." Reverend Bell closed the register and held it flat in both hands. "Witness," he said to the elders and to the sky, and to the soldiers who wanted not to watch. "This spring is held in trust for this town. Note it. Note us. Names written. Do not drown." He looked at the captain, who had the sense to look back and nod once like a man before a storm nods at the fence he built yesterday and hopes it holds. The soldiers moved to take Caleb's arm. He did not fight. He gave the cane to Mercy, and when her fingers wrapped it, something steadied that had been trembling since the dust devil in the arroyo. She felt the hinge click under her thumb without opening. She felt the feather tick her wrist. She did not speak, because if she did, her voice would break, and men would call that weakness and use it like a pry bar. They took Caleb along the bank toward the fort road. Beckett turned his horse without hurry and did not say good day, because the day had not been good, and he had the manners to know it. He signaled his men to follow, and they did, 2 by the road, and 1 into the brush, where a deer trail runs toward the spring. Little Fox saw that one, and made a note in the part of his mind where tracks live. Dorn walked a while with the soldiers, and then stopped and stood and watched them go. And when he came back, his boots left prints that would not be washed for a while. Eliza put her forehead to Mercy's for a second, and then pulled back, and made her face the place where Mercy could look without falling. They had not reached town when the first sign of next trouble showed. Jonah Pike's ledger, carried under his arm the way some men carry Bibles, slipped once when his hand twitched at a sudden noise and fell into the dust. The book hit wrong on a corner and gaped open to a page where old entries black as a funeral coat lined up like fence posts. Mercy bent to pick it up and saw a line she had not seen before. Not one of the 9, older, faded. A note in Jonah's careful hand. 4 unknowns. Riders. Paid in advance by H. She looked at Jonah, and he looked at the line, and then away, and his throat worked, and he said, to the air, to the dust, to his dead father who had kept a ledger before him, I should have burned that page, or testified sooner. Eliza said with no acid, only truth. Jonah flinched, as if the truth had struck him like a wet rope. I am testifying now, he said, and closed the book and his jaw, and walked on. They reached town, at suntilt. The square looked ready to forget if given permission. Men leaned in doorways, as if they had philosophies. Women shook rugs. A boy dragged a stick in the rut, and watched the line his stick made, like it might turn into a creek if he wanted it. Mercy went to the schoolhouse to put the tin under the floor, and found the board already pried, where she had lifted it the first time. She set the box down and listened. The room breathed. Eliza moved a chair. Little Fox scraped his boot and made a small face. Someone was here while we walked, he said. Mercy lifted the tin again. She did not trust floorboards any more. She set the box in the stove with the door open so she could see it, and sat in front of it with the cane across her knees. Eliza poured water and made coffee and set a cup down and watched Mercy's hands and thought of hands she had seen in church and in school and in the holding cell when she wrote the H by lamplight, and wondered if hands write their own books on the air while they work. Reverend Bell came with news from the church. The captain left a man to watch the register, he said. That's new. God has a guard now. Jonah came with his ledger and a strip of paper tucked into the page with the 4 unknowns. He set the book on Eliza's desk and tapped the strip. I copied the line, he said. If the ledger burns, that can speak. If my shop burns, this can speak. If my tongue falls out, this can speak. Eliza nodded and put the copy inside the school's McGuffey reader, where no man who hates letters will think to look. The sun leaned against the roofline. Mercy's mouth dried from coffee and grief and anger that had no place to go. Noise outside changed the way rooms change when a snake comes through. Hooves. Not many. The kind of measured clop men make when they want eyes and won't shout for them. Little Fox looked out through the edge of the curtain and came back thin. The man who didn't smile, he said. From last night, he has a sack for taking, not for giving. They stepped out together, not with guns drawn, not a picture, just people in a doorway who will not be pushed back in. The man on the bay horse wore no sign but the set of his shoulders. He looked at the schoolhouse door, at Mercy, at the cane, at the stove shadow behind her, as if the shape of the tin could cast a shadow through iron. He said nothing and rode on. It would have been easier if he had spat. Silence is harder, because it means a plan has been spoken already between men somewhere else, and all that remains is to play it. That night, the wind came up and rattled everything that could rattle. Shutters, signs, teeth. Mercy did not try to sleep. She sat with the cane across her knees and the tin cooling in the stove, and thought of Caleb walking under a name he had not chosen toward a fort that would call him by the wrong life. She thought of a feather tied to a hinge. She thought of Harlan Beckett's hat brim and of her own husband's ring winking on a dead man's rein. She might have slept 1 minute If she did, she dreamed a bell with a rope that had been cut, and still it rang because hands reached up and hit the metal bare and bled and didn't stop. Close to dawn, the messenger returned from the fort with a neat face and a statement he held like a baked pie. Habeas writ, he said, proud of the Latin as if he had just invented it. And when he said the next words, the pride dried into his throat like oil on a hot pan. Prisoner taken from custody at the river bridge by unknown parties. He read on because his mouth had to finish what his hand had started. Badge nailed to cottonwood. Regimental. The same badge we saw yesterday under a note from a man calling himself Red Jack Hollis. But he is dead, so that is a joke. Another note pinned below. If you want him, bring the deed, and bring the cane. Signed H. The square tilted as if a wind no one felt had shoved. Beckett's face did not change. He pressed his lips together as if tasting something. I told you, he said to no one and everyone, that lines can be cut. He swung up into his saddle and looked toward the cottonwood, like a man looks toward a church he hates, but must enter, to buy himself a kind of absolution. Little Fox put 2 fingers on the ground and felt for the print, not of hooves, but of shoes. He found what he needed. He stood and pointed southeast. Not to the fort, he said, to the ladder. Mercy stood with the cane and the tin and the whole town's thirst in her arms, and felt the old emptiness inside her make room for something new that did not feel like weight so much as direction. Then we go, she said. Eliza caught her arm. We go, she said, but we do not go like yesterday. We go with the register and the ledger like shields. We go with names. We go with old eyes. We go with women who can shoot and men who can read. We go with a bell in our mouths. Reverend Bell took the parish book from under the altar and put it in a flour sack and tied it with his own belt. Jonah Pike set 9 toe tags in his pocket and a 10th blank. He hated the blank more than he hated the others. Sheriff Dorn pinned his badge where a hat brim used to sit and looked toward where the cottonwood would show a brass circle, like a small sun, nailed to bark. Harlan Beckett's notary fussed with a pen he wouldn't need. Harlan Beckett himself checked his pistol and his paper and smiled the way a man smiles when he has figured the odds, and they come up in his column. They left at sunup, a line that was not a parade, not a posse, not a mob, not what the law recognizes as itself, something else. The Comanche elders were already walking when they passed the bend. Little Fox fell in with them without words. Mercy carried the cane. The feather swayed in rhythm with her steps, and at each sway, the hinge kissed the wood with a soft tick, like a pocket watch measuring heart. On the edge of town, a child ran after them with a slate and chalk. He pressed the slate into Eliza's hands and said, "For names." And Eliza wanted to cry, and didn't. She wiped her eyes with her wrist and chalked one letter on the slate big and plain, H. She held it up for the town to see. She held it up for the sky to see. She held it up for the man at the ladder who scratched names to see. Ahead, a bell rang where no rope hung, and no hand pulled, and no church stood. The sound came thin on the wind, and still it made bones vibrate. Mercy did not quicken. She did not slow. She walked like a woman who had learned that moving at the right pace keeps breath and keeps aim. The tin was under her arm. The cane was in her hand. The spring lived behind them. The cottonwood with the badge waited ahead. The rider who had used the letter H to hide his face had borrowed a dead outlaw's joke and would want the rest of the laugh. Mercy Kincaid had no jokes left. She had a deed, a feather, and a voice that now refused to say please. At Devil's Ladder, shadows gathered like cloth. Men waited with faces the county did not know yet and did not want to know. The badge gleamed on the cottonwood where Hollis's had hung the day before. Below it, a scrap of paper that had already started to curl in the dry showed a neat banker's hand. Bring the deed, bring the cane. No witnesses. Mercy looked at the letter twice. Then she looked at the ridgelines where witnesses already watched. She smiled. Not mean. Exact. From behind the cottonwood, a man stepped who wore no mask, because men like him believe a town is a mask they put on and take off at will. Harlan Beckett already stood 20 paces off with his hat brim level and his jaw square, and for the first time since he had ridden under the hotel awning, surprise nicked the edges of his composure. The man who stepped from the tree was not his. He was thinner and paler, with a clerk's pale hands and a ring with a bloodstone on his third finger. Sloan, the notary, the one with skinny wrists and a drawstring that had tied nothing. He had learned to move without sound since last night. He had learned to like it. "Good morning," Sloan said, and his voice no longer belonged to paper. It belonged to a room with the windows nailed and the door propped open with a dead man. He nodded to Mercy's tin and to the cane. "Let's finish our entries," he said. Behind him, in the strip of shade, Caleb stood with his hands bound, not with rope, but with the kind of straps you use to tie parcels when you want them neat. He was breathing. He did not look afraid. He looked like a man who knows what ledger page his name falls on and intends to argue about the arithmetic. Sloane's smile looked borrowed from a man who had paid too much for it. He gestured with his ring hand, and two shapes stepped out from the cottonwood shade, one with a rifle held low, one with a looped strap, like a gentleman's leash. Caleb stood between them with his wrists bound neat, the way parcels go on a bank shelf. He was pale, but his eyes were steady, and when they found Mercy, they held a kind of apology and a kind of welcome in the same glance. Mercy did not look at the strap. She looked at Sloane's thumb on the ring and thought of every paper that Thumb had pressed flat, while another man did the rough work. Harlan Beckett shifted in his saddle, as if the ground had changed under him by a hair. He did not like surprises that wore his suit, and spoke with another man's mouth. "Bring the deed," Sloane said. "Mrs. Kincaid, set it at the foot of the cottonwood. Lay the cane by it. Step away. Then I let the veteran go, and this county forgets itself and behaves." His voice had the clean edges of a blade you only use for envelopes. Mercy heard Beckett draw breath to reclaim the stage, then decide against it, because men like him let smaller men walk out ahead to trip wires first. Mercy looked at the paper nailed to the bark with the badge above it, the single letter signed like a dare. She lifted the tin just enough to make the light slick over its lid. The cane lay warm along her palm. The feather brushed her wrist. She said nothing. Little Fox did. "He smells like ink and fear," the boy said, soft enough for those closest to hear and loud enough for Sloane to feel. "Men who smell like that talk like law, then run like rabbits." Sloane's mouth pinched. He lifted a hand. The rifleman's barrel rose a finger's width. Harlan Beckett finally found the line he wanted. "Enough theater," he said. "Sloane, you work for me. Put the ring in your pocket and the deed in mine. Sheriff, you will take the veteran after we are civil here. Reverend, you will keep the book and bless the outcome. Undertaker, stop counting before I tell you to." He smiled with only one side of his face and tipped his hat toward the Comanche elders. "Gentlemen, you are welcome to witness a lawful exchange." The oldest elder looked at Beckett a long time, and then at Sloane, and then at Mercy, and then at the tree. He did not waste English. He touched the cottonwood with his palm and said a single syllable in his own tongue that made the younger men behind him shift as if something old had walked past. The word tasted like sap and winter, and a grave filled the right way. Reverend Bell took the parish register from the sack and set it beneath his hand on a flat rock. Jonah Pike took out 9 toe tags and the blank, and held the blank between 2 fingers like a worm he meant to hook and throw back. Sheriff Dorn put a hand to his belt to keep it from shaking. Eliza lifted her slate and showed the letter she had chalked for the ride. H. She held it steady, the chalk dust bright in the new sun. Mercy walked forward. Each step put the cane's ferrule down with a small click, like a pocket watch counting cents. She set the tin on the earth in the thin shade and laid the cane beside it, as if laying down a child to sleep. She did not step back. Sloane frowned. "Distance, please," he said. Mercy didn't move. Harlan Beckett shifted his horse and let his impatience show. "Do it," he told Sloane, a little sharpness in it this time. "Let the man go. Take the paper." Sloane reached, the ring glinting once. "Stop," Eliza said, and put her slate between his hand and the tin, the white H burning stupidly bright against bark and man and morning. "This is the initial that sits under the scratch in the sheriff's deposition," she said. "This is the letter written twice in Jonah Pike's ledger, next to unknown riders paid in advance. This is the hand that tried to sell a spring by cutting the rope on a town's bell. H is not for Hollis. Hollis is dead. H is for Harlan Beckett." She turned her face to Beckett, not to Sloane, and when she spoke again, her voice did not shake. "You hired men to do this work. You sent Sloane to take the deposition in the night. You put up the badge and the note so you could point to ghosts and claim clean hands." For a blink, Sloane stood like a man who has been named true in front of a mirror he did not expect. Then his smile snapped back on his face, like a mask twisted with a string. "Pretty talk," he said. "But the law is a book," Reverend Bell said, and he set his hand heavy on the parish register so the leather creaked. "Today the book has eyes." He looked past Sloane to Beckett and saw the correctness of the fit. He turned to Sheriff Dorn. "Tom," he said, using the name Eliza had used when they were children, "do you stand up now or sit down forever?" Sheriff Dorn inhaled through his teeth. The breath sounded like the one a man takes before he leans into a blow. He stepped between Sloane and the tin and put his palm out the way he did to Colt's. "No further," he said, and the voice was the law's voice cleaned of the sand that had clogged it. Beckett's shade cooled. He was not a man who forgave employees for losing control of a morning. Sloane moved first. He feinted at the tin with his left and went for the cane with his right, because small men always want the thing that makes them feel larger. Mercy had set the hinge toward her. She rolled the shaft under her hand, and the mouth of the cut-down rifle opened under Sloane's reaching fingers, like a snake under a careless boot. She didn't fire. She drove the ferrule down onto his toes. The sound he made would have embarrassed him in a smaller room. He snatched his foot back, and his rifleman jumped at the noise, and that jump twitched a trigger. The first bullet chewed bark and took the badge off the cottonwood with a bright ping. The brass spun out of sight. The second bullet came from a place no one expected, from the ridge to the right, where a soldier had tried to keep his hands clean and his conscience brown. He fired high to scare. He missed high and made God step aside. The third shot was the only one that mattered. Harlan Beckett, who preferred quills to flint, had drawn in the scrambling and aimed at Mercy, because that was the line men like him drew without thinking. Sheriff Dorn moved without thinking either. He turned and made his own body a wall and took the bullet in the meat of the shoulder with a sound like a hammer on an old plank. He staggered. Eliza screamed and then pulled the scream back into her teeth and held it there like a bit. Caleb moved. The man with the parcel strap had been lazy with the knot because he believed in paper more than in wrists. Caleb's hands came free with a burn and a curse, and his palm found the cane where Mercy's had left it. She knew he would take it. She let it go. He rolled the hinge shut and used the stick like a crook, the way he had in the wash, hooked Sloane behind the knee, and brought him down into the dust, where paper does not read as well. Sloane reached for his pistol and found none. He had left it with his pride in last night's chair. Beckett's second shot cracked the morning clean. The Comanche elders did not flinch. Little Fox rose from where he had gone low and put a flat stone in the path of the next bullet so that it sparked and sang and died. Reverend Bell did a thing he had hoped never to do again. He took the pistol from the flour sack where he had hidden the parish book and held it low and true. He did not fire. He leveled it at Beckett's thigh and spoke very plain. "Drop it," he said. Beckett's eyes traveled over the scene like a surveyor's transit, taking a final line. Sloane face down with his mouth full of dust. Dorn bleeding and upright with Eliza holding his arm, as if she could keep blood in by will. Caleb on one knee, with his weight on the bad leg, the cane ready. Mercy with the tin in both hands like a heart she intended to keep beating. Little Fox standing between men and tree. Elders silent and watching. Jonah Pike with his ledger tucked under his elbow and his pencil in his hand like a stiletto. Beckett saw that he had no angles left that would leave him untouched. He dropped the pistol. It hit the ground and shot once anyway, a stupid reflex, and bit his own boot heel. He grimaced and laughed a little and shook his head, as if at a child's trick that has cut the child's finger. "Clay Norton," a voice called from the ridge where the soldiers had tried to make their neutrality look noble. "Lay down arms." The captain's jaw worked. He did not have a page in his book for a banker pinned by a preacher and a woman with a deed set like a commandment on the ground. He did what soldiers do when the chapter runs out. He made a new line and pretended it had always been there. "Sheriff," he called instead, "handle your county. My men will witness." Dorn swayed. Eliza pressed her palm to the hole in him and felt the warm push between her fingers. He shook her off gently and stood on his own, because a man sometimes needs that for the last thing he does. He turned to Beckett. "Harlan," he said, the name flat, the friendliness pulled out of it like a nail. "You're under arrest for conspiracy to commit murder, for bribery, for theft of a public resource, for everything I don't have words for yet that has left 9 wax covers in Jonah Pike's room and 1 blank he carries because of you." He looked at Sloan. "You too." Sloan tried a word. Mercy didn't hear it because the wind came up in that second and carried the sound away. Wind does that with cowards talk sometimes. Beckett raised his chin. "You going to try to drag me to your little jail with that hole in your shirt?" he asked. Not unkind, just curious, like a man looking at a cracked cup and wondering if it will hold one more drink. "I'm going to walk you," Dorn said. He took 1 step and then another. He made it a dozen before the strength left his legs. When he fell, he did it slow and careful, as if setting a thing on a shelf. Eliza went down with him, not screaming now, the sound gone out of her like breath out of a bellows. Reverend Bell's mouth formed a prayer, and then closed on it. Men who have fired a pistol in front of God do not insult him with poor words. Beckett's eyes flicked at the opening that a dying lawman gives. Caleb saw the flick and braced, but before Beckett could move, Little Fox moved. He stepped in, and with a single hard, practiced motion, cut the bankman's belt with his knife, so clean, the holster fell with it. He put his heel on the leather. He did not smile. "No," he said. It was the sort of no a man says to a snake in a doorway on a day when he is not prepared to be bitten. Sloan did what men like him do, as a last act. He lunged at paper. He grabbed the tin and got hands on the deed and tore it free and ran 2 steps with words of ownership already forming in his throat. Mercy did what women who are done asking do. She took the cane from Caleb's hand in a single turn and let the hinge kiss open and let the shot out of its mouth. It hit Sloan low in the calf, and he fell onto his own ring hand with a cry that turned to a whine before the sound had finished. The deed flew. A gust took it and lifted it past the tree, past the badge glinting now in the dust, past the rock where Reverend Bell's book lay open, and set it skittering across the bend toward the water. Little Fox leaped like a colt and caught it with both palms flat and held it there hard enough to leave the print of his life in the fibers. Silence came the way it does after a rope snaps. It hung for a beat, and then the square of men and cottonwood and water began to breathe again. Jonah Pike bent and picked up Beckett's pistol by the barrel and handed it to the captain because sometimes a gravedigger knows which hand should hold which weight. The captain holstered it with an ashamed nod. He signaled his men. They took Sloan and Beckett, not roughly, not gently, the way you move a broken chair. They bound their hands, not neat, but firm. They did not meet eyes. Soldiers have their own books to write in and prefer clean margins. Eliza pressed linen to her brother's wound and watched his mouth try to form an excuse, and then a thank you, and then the right thing. The right thing came. "I should have stood earlier," he said. "Tell them I stood at the end." Eliza kissed his forehead. "You're standing," she said. And for a moment it was true, because words sometimes do that when a sister says them, and a man wants to believe. He breathed out and did not breathe in again. Reverend Bell wrote a line in the parish register with a hand that did not shake. Thomas Andrew Dorn, witness, corrupt, redeemed. He blotted the ink with the corner of his sleeve. Mercy's hands shook after, not during. She looked down at the cane and at the feather and at the tin and at the deed resting under Little Fox's palms. She took the paper and did a thing no one in that county had seen. She held it up for the elders and tore it, not to nothing, but in half, clean, then took the halves and laid them on the rock beside the parish book. "It goes to the town," she said, "not to a house, not to a man, not to me. Write it." Reverend Bell wrote it. The elders nodded once, the way men nod when a river changes course and does not wash a camp away. Jonah Pike opened his ledger and wrote 2 lines. Harlan Beckett, alive, wrapped, not waxed. Thomas A. Dorn, wax prepared, sister present. He kept the blank toe tag in his pocket. He had thought it for Jonah Pike once, then for Mercy, then for Caleb. He did not know whose name would need it now. The blank burned against his thigh. They walked back with the sun higher and the wind throwing grit into every open thought. The town saw Beckett under soldier rope and did not cheer. Good towns do not cheer when a man falls who has fed them salt with one hand and stones with the other. They watch. Watching is a kind of judgment that takes longer, but sticks deeper. The captain penned Beckett and Sloan in the jail and posted 2 men at the door who looked like boys until you saw their eyes. Eliza washed her hands slowly at the pump until the water ran clear, and then remembered it never runs clear. It only runs. Caleb lasted until late afternoon. He sat on the schoolhouse step with the cane across his knees and told Little Fox a short story about a cornfield back east and a girl with a red scarf who married a clerk because clerks do not die in ditches. He laughed once to show the joke could be small and still count. He asked Mercy for the cane back and turned it and made the hinge whisper once and shut. He looked at the feather. He looked at the sky. He stood with help, then without, then with again. He was a stubborn man. At the end, he did not lie down. Men who have slept on muddy ground too long do not trust it. He leaned his shoulder to the cottonwood set by the schoolhouse and closed his eyes and stayed there, weight forward, until the weight went. Mercy put her palm on his chest and found stillness where there had been the small hammer. She did not cry then. She did not have water for that kind of work. Little Fox took the feather from the cane and tied it into Mercy's hair without asking, because sometimes permission is a trap. Grief sets for strength. Jonah Pike wrote 9 wax covers that night for the Hollis men, already cooling in his room, and 1 more the day after, for Sheriff Dorn, and 1 more after that, for a veteran who refused to go horizontal. He left 1 toe tag blank in the drawer, like a question you do not ask, because the answer will find you. Eliza took the sheriff's deposition from the drawer and inked a bracket beside the scratch and wrote, in her small, neat hand, the letter Harlan, where the H had shown through. She did it without triumph. She did it because paper needs clean edges when blood has dried crooked. The captain made a statement. He said words about custody and inquiry and territorial authority. Few listened. People were out at the spring watching water breathe like a living thing in the heat. Reverend Bell stood on the church step and read the line he had written about the trust, until men who could not read could say it with their mouths. The elders stood on the hill and watched for a while, and then turned and went away by a path only they use. Little Fox walked with them as far as the bend, then came back because he had tied a feather to a stick and gave it away, and wanted to see what would grow in the space where that leaving had been. Mercy slept on Eliza's cot and woke to the sound of paper moving. She thought of Sloane's ring and Beckett's hat and slipped her hand under the pillow for the cane and remembered the second weight gone. She lay still, absorbing that, and then sat up because the sound was not paper. It was a boy's slate being held wrong. On the desk lay Jonah's copied strip, the one with 4 unknowns, writers, paid in advance by H, and beside it the school book with the chalked H turned sideways to look like the rung of a ladder. Eliza came in with coffee and saw the arrangement and smiled a little because sometimes a room rearranges itself into a sermon and you didn't have to write it. They walked to the undertaker's together. Jonah had the ledger open to a page where the fresh entries looked like sharp teeth. He tapped the corner. "I kept count," he said. 9, then 10, then 1 more. He did not say the last aloud. Mercy didn't need it said. She touched the page where Caleb's entry began and ended in the same line. The wax beside it was smooth and blank, polished with a finger. She ran her thumb over it. It warmed a little. That is not a trick. Wax does that when a living person touches it. By late day, men hauled rough lumber to the hill, and women cooked and children ran with the manageable wildness grief allows. When watched, the soldiers stood in a square that did not touch anyone. Beckett sat in the cell and stared at a crack in the plaster and tried not to see the little valley he had imagined with his sluice and tally sticks, water sweet and coin sweeter. Sloane lay on the cot in the next cell and turned his ring round and watched his own hand as if it belonged to a story where the hero has handsome fingers. He did not ask for paper. No one brought him any. At sundown, Reverend Bell said words over Dorn and did not gild them. He said words over Caleb and did not blunt them. He put both names in the register and closed it and tied it shut with his belt again. And for a moment, the closed book on the altar looked like a chest over a heart. Eliza stood with Mercy at the back, and when the bell rang, they both flinched, then set their jaws, then let the sound wash through them. Bells can hurt. They can also tune bones. The town slept the way towns sleep after they have lost and gained too much in one day. Mercy went alone to the spring, an hour after dark. She stood where the night air felt almost like cloth over skin. She spoke out loud quietly to a man who was dead, and to a man who had learned too late which side weighed more, and to a boy who walked between two worlds with ease that would one day cost him. She said she would keep the peace as far as her two hands could reach, and then find hands to reach farther. She did not promise never to pick up the cane. She was done with that kind of promise. She promised instead that when she did, it would be for living, not for carving trophies. When she turned back, a rider sat his horse at the edge of shadow. He wore no badge. He wore a coat city men favor when they come west to buy a story. He touched his hat to her and smiled thin. "Mrs. Kincaid," he said, "I am from the adjutant's office. I have been asked to collect certain papers, the deposition, the hospital file, any ledgers relevant." "No," Mercy said. The man kept smiling because paper teaches men to smile when no works. "We can do this politely," he said. "Is Reverend Bell at home? Perhaps the sheriff? Perhaps—" "The sheriff is in the earth," Mercy said. "The Reverend sleeps. The undertaker is counting. You can come back when the register writes you a place." She turned away, not rudely, exactly as if he were a strange dog, and she did not intend to run and make it chase. The rider watched her walk, and then looked at the spring, and then at the sky as if consulting a calendar no one could see, and rode away without dust, because some men learn that trick for leaving no votes behind. Morning brought no more soldiers, and one letter nailed to the church door, sealed with wax that had been impressed with a coin rather than a seal. It said the territorial court would convene somewhere east and take testimony if it found time. It said names that avoided Harlan Beckett and landed hard on Sloane, because that is how men write when they need a place to put their ink that will not stain their friends. Eliza read it, took it down, folded it small, and put it into the school book behind the page, where H still showed in chalk. "We will bring our own court when we must," she said, and she meant the square, and the spring, and the place under the cottonwood, where truth had been spoken without permission. Weeks do not pass in a day, but once a county has found its true weight, you can feel the scale settle, even when the pan still trembles. Men came to the spring with buckets, and left with eyes that did not slide toward a vault. Women took turns at the pump, without counting how many swings belonged to which house. Little Fox taught boys to read antlines and wind seams, while Eliza taught them to shape letters into ropes that could hold people honest. Jonah stopped sharpening his pencil when there was nothing to write, and learned to sit quiet with his ledger closed, without fearing silence would fill with ghosts. Reverend Bell preached small and worked large. He mended a fence with his hands, and did not point it out from the pulpit, because some sermons only land when no one points. Beckett waited for men to come from east, with paper thick enough to smother a spring. Some came, Mercy met them with the register open, and the elders standing, and the undertaker's ledger ready, and the cane laid like a commandment on the table. The men from East looked at all that, and saw more work than pay, and adjusted their hats, and rode back with reports that said the county was trouble, and would not reckon tidy. Sloane stood trial in a room that smelled of sweat and opinion, and did not end with a gallows, because some endings earn a longer pain. He was sent to a place with bars, where men carve initials into wood, and wonder why letters do not love them back. On the night after the trial, a stranger came through town and stood at the sheriff's desk, and asked to see records the way men ask for the menu at a dining room they cannot afford. Eliza looked at him. He had a soft, square jaw, and a new coat, and hands that liked to stay clean. She took out the deposition with the scratched name, and laid it down, and let him read until his face drained to match the gray glove he worried in his left hand. He did not ask for the hospital file. He did not ask for the ledger. He put the glove on, and left walking very straight, and the way he mounted his horse said his legs had learned a new truth that morning, and did not like it. Mercy visited the spring at dusk and dawn. She spoke to it sometimes the way people speak to graves and to babies and to animals that carry a human name without complaint. She said she would not leave it in a vault. She said she would write it in a book under God, and under the eyes of men who remember before ink. She said she would only open the cane when opening it would close harm. She kept that. When men rode through with hair braided with trophies, she made the hinge kiss the light once, and the men looked at her hands and decided to drink and ride on. In Jonah Pike's shop, the ledger lay shut more days than open. When he turned to the page with the 9 wax covers for the first square, and the later lines for a sheriff and a veteran, he sometimes put his hand over the blank. It grew warm as wax can, the way sorrow warms when you hold it, not to make it leave, but to teach it where to sit. Eliza found him once like that, and he said without looking up, "I think this tag is mine." Eliza shook her head. "Not while you hold the pencil," she said. He smiled at that, and did not argue. Mercy wore the feather little Fox had tied into her hair until it frayed, and then she wore the fray. People who make jokes about such things stopped when they saw her carrying the cane with the hinge that had spoken once at a cottonwood and changed the balance in a man like Beckett. The spring did not make more water, but it did not make less. Sometimes the wind rang through the church's open door and made the bell speak softly when no hand had the rope. Some said it was heat. Some said it was memory tugging. Reverend Bell said nothing. He favored doors that let wind pass and let names stay. At the edge of harvest, before the first cold night, Mercy walked the arroyo where a wheel had once spun without touching earth. The groove of the E8 wheel still showed itself in the hard pack, like a sentence scratched into a bench with a knife. Vultures rode high, not counting her. She put her palm to the plank where a tin had once hidden, like a heart under a rib cage. She smiled, a small private shape of mouth, at the creature she had been then. She set the cane on the wagon tongue and looked out across the country that had tried to eat her, and had, in its rude way, taught her to chew back. In the sheriff's office, Eliza kept her brother's badge in a shallow dish and did not polish it. She left the scratch on the deposition, visible under a small pane of glass, so schoolchildren could see what one letter can do when it refuses to die. She added a note in the margin of the school McGuffey reader. H is for Harlan. H is for Hollis. H is for 100 hands who think ink makes them clean. She never said it aloud. Children read it anyway. The last thing Caleb North left that anyone could touch was the cane. The last thing he left no one could take was the space between killing and keeping peace that Mercy filled with her 2 hands. When wind scoured the square and grit stung gums and eyes, townspeople walked with their lips set and their shoulders down and their eyes not looking for a vault to put their fear in. They had a spring and a book and a ledger and a bell and a woman who would not step back when a clerk smiled. On a morning when the sky looked like hammered tin and thunder crawled on far buttes and brought no rain, a stranger sat in the archive at the county seat and traced with one fingernail the place on the sheriff's deposition where the scratch had been, and the letter had pushed through. He smiled and did not look pleased. He closed the folder and put it back and wiped his finger on his coat. The clerk behind the counter asked if he needed copies. He said he had already made the ones that mattered. He left a coin on the desk with a bloodstone pressed into wax, as if that meant the coin would stay. It did not. Coins do what they want. If you go to the spring now and put your ear to the water, you can hear 3 sounds, if you are the sort to listen: a bell rung without rope, a feather touching wood at a hinge, and a pencil making a small mark before a man has the courage to say the words out loud. The parish register hides no names under smear on those pages, though elsewhere a tremor of ink shows where a hand once tried. The undertaker's bill carries a charge that people once asked about and now understand. The hospital file at Fort Stanton lists a man who died twice and lived once, and no clerk has fixed it because some errors teach better than clean copy. If you want the line Jonah Pike never filled, the blank toe tag he kept for the person who thought paper could erase water, the way the bell rings when wind remembers, the scratched letter that would not stay dead, and the hinge that knows when to open. Look where the records sleep. The next page you turn will tell you which. Name the ledger was waiting to learn.